All right, hands up out there in YouTube land. Who has ever been in a position where you just wanted to end it and quit? And yeah, obviously, there's things that you can quit that are a good choice and things that you can quit that are a bad choice. But coming to the point where you want to stop doing something is part of life. And obviously, quitting can lead to positive change. There can be a lot of ways you can improve your life by stopping bad behavior. There can also be things about quitting that can lead to, well, good or bad, like, quitting a job. Maybe it's a good thing, maybe it's a bad thing. What I want to talk about today is the phenomenon of quitting comics. And I don't mean the idea of pros leaving mainstream comics and, doing independent stuff. What I mean is those of us who grew up with giant long white boxes in our closet, in our bedroom, in our living room, and in, the attic. Well, comic books have been a big part of our lives. My first job was in a comic book store. And whether you have long white boxes or you just have a stack of favorite issues, it tends to be something that is part of what you grew up with. It's a part of your childhood memory, and a lot of times that's why we keep back issues, because it reminds us of a more innocent time when we didn't have mortgages and, adult things. When I grew up as a little girl at summer camp, I remember reading my very first comic book in my bunk with my friends. In fact, I still have that actual issue on my wall. It's Iron Man 203, which was one of the first issues I learned as an adult that he wore his silver samurai armor. Back then, I just thought this is what Iron Man looked like because, this was my first comic ever. It literally came to me from my grandfather, who mailed it to summer camp in a large trunk from his basement a friend had left there years ago. It's that stereotypical. So, what is it that makes people want to walk away from comic books? It's a really interesting phenomenon that something where that can be, so cherished we can sort of turn our backs on it and say, nope, I'm not doing this anymore. I'm actually making a conscious decision. And you don't really see this in other media. I mean, obviously there are things where you upgrade. Those of us who had Betamax eventually got VHS, and those of us who had VHS eventually got Laserdiscs, and Laserdiscs then begat DVDs, and DVDs begat Blu-ray, and Blu-ray begat streaming, and you get the point. But you're still enjoying movies. You're just upgrading your format. No one ever wakes up and says, I'm going to quit radio. From now on, for the rest of my life, I'm never going to listen to radio, or I'm going to quit books. I'll never read a book again, or I'm going to quit newspapers because, wait, do people even know what newspapers are anymore? Do they? I don't know.
It's like I picked the wrong week to quit smoking.
The point is, comic books have this sort of special thing where people actually do say that. They make a conscious decision in their lives that I'm not going to read comic books anymore. And obviously, there's a lot of factors that can lead to this. Maybe it's because you discover dating, and suddenly you want to look cooler in the eyes of the people you want to date. And maybe it's because the comic books you've been reading suddenly change all the continuity and throw out stories that were beloved to you, and you feel like, okay, well, if none of the stories I read count anymore, what's the point of reading? I'm not picking on DC, I'm just using an example. Or maybe the character you've been following, the story ends and he dies by, tripping on himself while he gets out of bed. Sorry, spoiler warnings. So what about the fact that comic books are for kids, right? And it's seen that, okay, now that I'm an adult, I'm not going to read something for kids. Well, I absolutely highly recommend Understanding Comics by Scott McCloud. If you've never read this book, it's one of the best books I've read. It's really enlightening the way he breaks down the visual medium of comic books. If you, again, pick it up, it's you can get it, probably used off Amazon for not too much. It's pretty fascinating. And it really shows how, yes, comic books can be for kids, but we're talking about an art medium. We're not talking about something that is designed for children like the way, Sesame Street is, a learning show. There are comic books that are just as adult as anything else out there. And you can find a variety of comic books that appeal to adults, both the superhero genre and historical tales and emotional tales. And even comic books like the superhero genre that used to be very focused on kids, well, you can find superhero comic books today that still have the same type of storytelling, but do it in a more adult way with more adult themes, and are kind of reflections on the way comic books used to be when they were exclusively marketed to kids. So then that brings back to the question is why do people consciously quit comic books? No one says, again, I'm going to quit TV or I'm going to quit magazines. Well, magazines don't exist either. Is it because we're adulting and, again, they feel like this is something that should be part of their childhood? Well, obviously, the vast, vast amount of comic book sales are to adults these days. Kids are reading some comic books, but it's not like it was back in the 40s or even the 60s and 70s when comic books were made for kids. I mean, even, anything adult had to have a label slapped on it. So with more and more adults reading comics and less kids, and they're aimed at adults, how is it they're dropping off, especially when comic book heroes are more mainstream than ever? I mean, the highest grossing movies are all superhero based, mostly the Marvel movies, but it does help introduce the world to characters. I mean, 2 decades ago, nobody knew who Guardians of the Galaxy or even Iron Man was outside, comic book circles. And DC's gotten a piece of the pie, mostly with their, television series. My daughter happens to be addicted to The Flash. And comic books are cool. I mean, nerd culture, shall we say, or geek culture is kind of no longer this thing that you have to hide in the shadows and, only exclusively discuss at other comic book conventions or in chat rooms. It's cool to be a comic book fan. The girls who wouldn't talk to me in junior high are now showing up at Comic-Con in, scantily clad superhero outfits. So with this giant reversal of how mass culture looks at comic books, why is it we still see people saying, I'm not going to read superhero comics anymore? Because again, you don't do that to other media. No one says, no more paperbacks, no more hardbacks, no more, I'm not going to consume this type of media. And maybe that's what it is, that the medium is the message. And you have to look at, well, what's different about comic books? And the fact that they have made a fundamental change in the last 20 years. That's different from how they were in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s. So the old way versus the new way. What happened to comic books that makes them less appealing? And I think part of that is the lack of new characters. Yes, there have been new characters introduced over the last 20 years, but how many of them are truly breakthrough characters that have a huge fan base? If you look back at the 1940s, what was considered the golden age of comics, I mean, there were hundreds, if not thousands of characters, a lot of them now in public domain, that were introduced. Some of them went on to become, cultural icons, Batman and Superman, Captain Marvel. I'm talking about the Fawcett Captain Marvel here, Billy Batson, Shazam. Anyway, that's a whole other thing. And fast forward to the 1960s, the Silver Age, and you had another huge renaissance of brand new characters being introduced, both the Marvel house and DC house. In the 90s, comic book companies like Valiant brought back characters, and Image Comics, when it was founded, introduced what was kind of going to be like a new universe for a new generation. So, looking today, comic book characters are corporate property. Most large comic book companies, Warner is, DC is owned by Warner, which is owned by AT&T. Marvel is owned by Disney. So the characters are less characters and more corporate icons these days, which means because they're vested and they make money for these large corporations that now own them, and not that Marvel and DC weren't corporations, but they now have parent companies. So the stories tend to not have any consequences because nothing can happen to Spider-Man or Batman for a long time. And really the question is, what's the consequence of no consequences? When you know nothing's going to happen to the character, that, sure, Superman died.
We got better.
And Spider-Man has died.
We got better.
Even Spawn, who is an undead character, died by his own hand.
We got better.
So when you look at the new characters that have been created over the last 20, 10, 15 years, they're kind of, Spider-Gwen is just another version of Spider-Man. Deadpool, Venom, another version of Venom or Deadpool. I mean, yeah, you've got exceptions, characters like Invincible, and I'm actually going to get back to him in a moment. And there have been characters outside of the comic medium that have broken through in pop culture that are sort of brand new. Harry Potter and Katniss, new characters in the last 20-ish years. But it's very different than it was in the 60s when Jack Kirby created an entire universe, both at Marvel and DC. I mean, he didn't create all the DC characters, but he did a lot of work. Nowadays, all these characters that were brand new in the 60s, they're back, but they're all doing just the same thing. They're kind of like walking through the motions. And there's nothing unexpected because there can't be any consequences. You can't just kill off Batman or kill off Iron Man or Wolverine because they make too much money for companies. So there's no feeling of, I guess, change. I mean, obviously Batman is different than he was in the 60s versus he is, in the 2000s, but he's still Batman. And we're not going to see the Joker, if you will, off Batman, and Batman never exists anymore. So my thoughts are, you got to do something unique. Comic books need to do something that no other medium can do. And the first thing is, tell good stories. When you tell good stories, people will read them and have consequences. With everyone being in corporate media, it's tough now, but if there isn't a consequence to a story, there's no drama. And if there's no drama, there's no feeling. So, yes, when characters are invincible, no pun intended, it feels like there's no really reason to keep reading because nothing's ever going to happen to them. Nothing can get them.
So
if nothing can
what
get
you're saying
them,
is, I am indestructible.
Oh, no.
Well, I hope you enjoyed this video and a look at why I kind of think people are saying I'm not reading comics anymore. Are you? Are you saying that? Are you still reading comics? What are you reading? Let me know in the comments below. Like and subscribe to this channel, and I'll see you at the next video. Thanks for watching.